A child's bike lies rusting in the front yard of a home that never sold. The auction sign out front is crooked now, its bold red letters faded by months of sun and rain. Across the street, the windows stay shut, curtains drawn tight. No one has moved in. No one has moved out. But the grass is trimmed once a week by someone who doesn't live there. In cities, tower cranes hang frozen above half-finished apartments, their steel arms stretched skyward like a question left unanswered. The work has stopped. The noise has gone quiet, and all that remains is concrete, silence, and debt. Across Australia, something once solid is beginning to give way. Rents have soared beyond reach. Mortgage stress is spreading like frost on glass. In small towns, people pack what they can and leave, not because they want to, but because they must. Families double up under one roof. Retirees open spare rooms to their adult children. Promises made to generations that hard work would buy security, that land would hold value, are fraying. And in their place, uncertainty grows. Quiet, heavy, unshakable. They call it a market correction, a phase, a cycle. But if you look closely, this feels different. This feels permanent. Because what's faltering is not just a price tag, it's the idea of home itself. What happens to a country when shelter becomes a luxury? When the dream becomes the danger? Stay with us, because what's unfolding may not make the evening news, but in time, it may reach your street. Number 10. Record-level household debt. For generations, the Australian dream was built on a simple foundation: hard work, steady savings, and a home to call your own. It was a promise parents made to their children that if you stayed the course, there'd be a roof over your head and roots in your community. Streets were quiet, mortgages were manageable, and debt was something you paid off, not carried like a second shadow. But beneath that familiar dream, something changed. Quietly, systematically. Today, Australia holds one of the highest household debt levels in the developed world. Debt now stretches far beyond the young and the reckless. It wraps around families, retirees, and even those who once believed they were safe. The average household owes nearly twice its disposable income, and the cost of simply staying put grows heavier by the month. What once felt like progress, a second property, a loan for renovations, now feels more like quicksand. You can see it in the suburbs, couples in their 60s taking on new mortgages, grandparents co-signing loans for homes their grandchildren will likely never own. Small towns where families are quietly selling up, not to move forward, but to avoid falling behind. Debt, once a tool, has become a trap, quietly robbing people, not just of wealth, but of peace. And so we must ask, what do we leave behind when even financial security becomes a burden? What kind of future are we building when the price of stability is lifelong debt? For a nation that once prided itself on giving each generation more than the last, the very measure of progress is now in question. This isn't a collapse in numbers, it's a fracture in values. And the cracks are beginning to show in places we once believed were unshakable. Number 9. Negative gearing and the culture of speculation. There was a time when a home was just that. A home, not a portfolio asset, not a tax shelter, just a place to grow old, to raise children, to rest. In the post-war decades, owning property meant planting roots. It meant stability, but somewhere along the line, that meaning began to shift, quietly, then rapidly. And today, Australia's housing market has become less about shelter and more about speculation. At the heart of this transformation lies a policy called negative gearing. Introduced to help investors offset losses, it slowly evolved into a powerful incentive, one that rewarded owning multiple properties, often at the expense of those trying to buy their first. Investors borrowed more, bid higher, and were tax protected for doing so. What began as support turned into strategy. Homes became chips on a game board, a game that millions were never invited to play. Now ordinary Australians compete, not just with each other, but with an entire culture built on profit over place. First home buyers are routinely outbid by those chasing capital gains. Suburbs once filled with neighbors are now scattered with Airbnb listings and vacant investment properties. Families are priced out, not because they're reckless, but because the system no longer sees them as priority. And so the question rises, quiet but sharp. What happens when a home is no longer something you live in, but something you trade? When the right to live gives way to the right to profit? For older Australians who remember a different ethic, where stability mattered more than leverage. This shift feels not just unfair, but unrecognizable. This isn't just market policy, it's a redefinition of home itself. And it has set in motion a crisis that money alone can no longer solve. Let's look now at what happens when the builders stop building and the ground begins to hollow. Number 8. Construction crisis and developer collapse. Not long ago, the skyline was a symbol of growth. Tower cranes moved like clockwork above cities. Suburbs stretched further each year. Builders laid concrete with quiet confidence, fueled by demand, and the belief that progress was unstoppable. It felt like momentum, as if Australia could build its way out of any housing shortage. But today that rhythm has stalled. Half-finished developments stand like monuments to a promise unkept. More than 2,500 construction firms collapsed in just 1 year, brought down by soaring material costs, labor shortages, and fixed-price contracts that no longer make sense. Behind every closed site office is a tangle of halted dreams. Young families waiting on homes that won't be finished, retirees who've lost deposits, and workers unpaid for months of labor. The failure isn't just economic, it's deeply human. In outer Melbourne, a couple in their 70s sold their home to fund a new build closer to medical care. The project folded midway. Now they live in a rental, paying more than their pension allows, their savings gone. In regional towns, builders walk off the job not by choice, but by necessity, leaving behind scaffolding, dust, and silence. And so we ask, what does it mean when a country can no longer complete what it began? When homes are started, but never lived in, when labor is spent, but never honored. This is more than a supply crisis. It's a breach in trust, a signal that something foundational is no longer holding. The scaffolding may still stand, but the system beneath is crumbling. And soon, the shortage will not be of homes, but of faith. Next, we turn to a different kind of scarcity, one where houses exist. Number 7. Housing supply. Mismatch, not shortage. At first glance, it's easy to believe the problem is simple: not enough homes. That's the story repeated across headlines and press releases. Build more, and the crisis will fade. But the truth is more complicated and more unsettling. Australia doesn't just suffer from a lack of housing, it suffers from a deep mismatch between what is built and what is needed. Drive through outer suburbs, and you'll see it. Rows of brand new townhouses, many dark at night. In the city's gleaming apartment towers pierce the sky, while millions are priced out of what lies within. The numbers tell a strange story. More than 1 million homes sit unoccupied across the country, even as demand for affordable housing surges. The issue isn't only about quantity, it's about purpose and priorities. For low-income families, there are no options. For single pensioners, downsizing becomes a paradox. Smaller doesn't mean cheaper. And for young workers, the entry point keeps moving out of reach. Developers build where profits are highest, not where communities are strongest. In the process, we are left with a landscape of availability without accessibility. Imagine a bookshelf full of titles no one can read. That's the housing market today, filled with homes no one can enter, dreams no one can touch. And so we ask, what use is supply when the shelves are lined with the unaffordable, when the system keeps building for profit, while the people it once served are left outside? This isn't a housing shortage. It's a housing disconnect between what's built and what's needed, between market logic and human life. And as the gap widens, it is not only the poor who suffer, it is the very fabric of the nation that begins to tear. But there's another force pulling that fabric apart, one that begins not in construction, but in the paycheck. Number 6. Wage stagnation versus runaway prices. There was a time when a full-time job was enough. A single income could support a family, pay the mortgage, and leave something aside for the future. Pay rises came steadily, in line with living costs, and owning a home, even modest, was seen as a birthright, not a battle. But today, that balance is gone. The seesaw between wages and house prices has hit its, and it's not tilting back. Since the year 2000, Australian home prices have surged by over 250%, wages barely 70%. The gap is not just economic, it's generational. Young people work just as hard, study longer, and save more carefully. Yet they end up with less, not through failure, but through a system that no longer rewards labor as it once did. And this pressure isn't confined to the young. Retired couples watch as their children, now in their 40s, are still renting. Grandparents see their adult grandchildren moving back home, not out of choice, but out of necessity. The sense of progress, of momentum from one generation to the next, has begun to falter. In a nation as wealthy as Australia, this raises a hard question. What does it mean when work no longer buys dignity, when doing everything right still isn't enough? The promise that shaped post-war Australia, that effort would be met with opportunity, is no longer being kept. This is not simply a story of numbers. It's a slow erosion of fairness. And for many, it feels as though the ladder has been pulled up, just as they reached for the first rung. But there's another pressure now tightening its grip, one that doesn't just take from wages, but multiplies the burden of debt. If this story echoes something you've seen or felt, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to follow the full journey as it unfolds, piece by piece. Let us know where you're watching from and what moment stayed with you, because sometimes the quietest truths are the ones we share together. Number 5. Interest rate shockwaves. There was a time when a fixed mortgage was a promise, quiet, dependable, and clear. A pact between borrower and lender that the roof overhead would be secure, predictable, affordable. Homeowners could plan, grow old in place, help their children start their own lives. Interest rates shifted, yes, but slowly, gently, over years. Today that rhythm is broken. Interest rates now rise with a speed and violence unfamiliar to a generation who built their lives on steadier ground. In less than 18 months, some Australian households have seen their monthly payments double. Those who once budgeted carefully now find themselves on the edge, not because of recklessness, but because the rules changed faster than anyone could adapt. In living rooms once filled with peace, there is now a quiet panic. Retirees open their mail with dread. Young families eat dinner beneath the hum of a kitchen light they might soon have to switch off. Over 1 million households are now trapped in mortgage prison, unable to refinance, unable to sell, and unable to breathe. And so we ask, what kind of future do we create when stability becomes a luxury? When the cost of staying in the home you already own becomes greater than the price of ambition itself? In a nation once defined by steady hands and quiet confidence, volatility has crept in like a slow tide, soaking through foundations thought to be safe. This isn't just about percentages, it's about pressure, silent, rising, and deeply personal. And as that pressure builds, it begins to displace more than just comfort. It pushes people out of cities, out of options, and sometimes out of the life they once knew. Let's turn now to the places straining beneath the weight of migration and the limits of what infrastructure can hold. Number 4. Migration pressure without infrastructure. Australia has always been a nation shaped by movement. From distant shores, people arrived with hope in their eyes and work in their hands. Migration built cities, economies, and entire communities, and with it came the quiet promise that this country could grow without breaking. For decades, that promise held. Streets stretched to welcome the new schools, roads, hospitals. They rose alongside the people who needed them. But today, something is different. Migration has surged to record levels, yet the services meant to support it have not kept pace. New arrivals settle into overcrowded suburbs. Public transport runs behind schedule. Hospitals overflow. Rents skyrocket, not because there are no homes, but because there are too few homes people can afford in places where they're needed most. In working-class neighborhoods, 3 families share a single dwelling. In outer suburbs, pensioners quietly move further from their lifelong homes, priced out by the demand around them. A sense of place, of belonging, is being stretched thin, and for many, what once felt like a shared future now feels like a competition for space, time, and dignity. So we must ask, what is the cost of growth without care? When infrastructure lags behind policy, and people become numbers, not neighbors, the question isn't whether migration should happen. It's whether we're still willing to build the foundation that makes it possible to thrive. This isn't a question of borders. It's a question of balance between welcome and readiness, between compassion and capacity. And when that balance tips, it isn't just new arrivals who suffer, but the very communities they hope to join. Next, we journey to places quietly emptying, where families once built futures and are now packing up to leave them behind. Number 3. Regional displacement and vanishing towns. And for light us at a time when Australia's heartland pulsed strong, small towns thrived with post offices, corner stores, and Friday night footy. Generations lived within a few blocks of one another. Parents, children, and grandparents, all part of the same thread. Life was slower, but not lesser. There was pride in staying, in knowing your neighbor, in calling one place home for decades. But now, the silence in these places is deafening. Schools close for lack of students. GP clinics shut down when doctors won't stay. Local shops close, not from lack of spirit, but from a shrinking customer base. The drought of opportunity has lasted too long. And for many, the choice is no longer between staying or leaving. It's between surviving or not. On the edge of New South Wales, a couple in their 70s locks the door of the home they've owned for 40 years. It's not because they want to go, but because there are no services left. The pharmacy shut last spring. The nearest hospital is over an hour away. Their grandchildren moved to the city, not for ambition, but for necessity. And with each farewell, a little more of the town disappears. So we ask, what happens when the places that once built the nation are left to wither? When roots are pulled from the soil and nothing is planted in their place? A home is more than a house, and a town is more than its map. It's a memory, a rhythm, a way of life. And as regional Australia empties out, the loss is not just local, it is national. Next, we move to the edges of those towns, to the ghost suburbs, where lights are off, yet the deeds are held by someone far away. Number 2, foreign investment and ghost neighborhoods. Then the heat in the soft glow of evening, the streets look almost perfect. Clean driveways, trimmed hedges, the soft hum of street lamps flickering on. But behind the quiet, there's an emptiness that no photograph can capture. The lights are off, the blinds are drawn. No one comes or goes. Entire blocks in some new suburbs sit in stillness, not abandoned, but unoccupied. These are ghost neighborhoods, and their rise has been anything but accidental. Over the last decade, foreign investment in Australian real estate has soared, transforming homes into commodities for global portfolios. In many cases, these properties aren't lived in. They're held as assets, as insurance, as bets on a market that for a time never seemed to lose. The result: streets without stories, parks without children, communities without neighbors. In outer Sydney, one council counted nearly 1 in 5 homes sitting empty in a newly built development. The buildings are there, but the life has not arrived. And for Australians searching for somewhere to live, the irony is suffocating. Homes everywhere, but none within reach. For those who built this country, who remember what a neighborhood used to feel like, this transformation is hard to watch. Not because change is unwelcome, but because this change leaves nothing in its place. Just rows of locked doors and rising prices. So we ask, what kind of society are we shaping when a house can be bought, but never lived in? When the very idea of home is exported and emptied, the question isn't about borders, it's about belonging. And as we approach the final chapter, we look not just at property, but at the breaking of something far more fragile: trust in the national promise. Number 1, the cracked social contract. The social contract in Australia was quiet but clear. If you worked hard, paid your taxes, raised your family, and played by the rules, the country would take care of you in return. It was never written down. It didn't need to be. It lived in backyards, in payslips, in weekends, at the beach. It was the belief that this land, vast and resource-rich, had room for everyone, not just to survive, but to belong. But today, that promise feels broken, not in one moment, but in 1,000 quiet ways. The home that was once a reward for sacrifice is now a battleground for survival. Families who once built lives on single incomes now rely on 3 just to get by. Elder Australians who gave their working years to this country now watch their children and grandchildren rent indefinitely, priced out of the very suburbs they grew up in. The numbers no longer add up, but more painfully, neither does the story. The idea that each generation would have more security than the last has slipped through our fingers. And in its place is something older Australians recognize well: uncertainty, the kind many hoped their children would never have to know. So we must ask, what happens to a nation when it can no longer keep its word, not just to individuals, but to entire generations? If the dream of home, of stability, of upward movement is no longer real, what then remains to pass on? This isn't just a housing crisis, it's a moral one. Because when trust is lost, when the foundation cracks, even the strongest walls cannot stand. But this story doesn't end here. It echoes outward into every part of Australian life. What we've just seen isn't just news. It's a mirror held up to a country at a crossroads. These aren't isolated trends or economic footnotes. They are the slow, steady signs of a system under strain. One where the foundation of housing, family stability, and generational promise is beginning to crack. Behind every data point, there is a real story. A pensioner wondering how long they can keep their home. A young couple trapped between rising rents and unreachable mortgages. A community watching familiar streets grow empty, then unfamiliar. This crisis touches everyone, not just those who've been priced out, but those who believed the rules would protect them. There's no single fix, but there is a path through awareness, through smarter policy, and through holding decision makers accountable. We cannot rebuild trust overnight, but we can begin by asking the right questions, by demanding long-term thinking over short-term profit, and by remembering that housing is not just an asset, it's a human need. If this story matters to you, subscribe for more investigations like this. Let us know where you're watching from and what part of this story stayed with you. And if you know someone who should see this, share it with them, because understanding the problem is the first step toward change.